No one wakes up expecting their marriage to end in blood. That morning in Washington, D.C. began like any other, quiet, routine, unremarkable. The neighborhood was already alive with the usual sounds of a weekday. Engine starting, doors closing, footsteps moving with purpose. To the outside world, there was nothing unusual about the couple preparing to leave their home together. No shouting, no neighbors watching from their windows, no visible signs of trouble. They had been married for years. Not perfect, but stable enough, at least on the surface. Friends would later describe them as private people, not overly affectionate in public, but not hostile either. The kind of couple that didn't air their problems for others to see. What no one could see was the tension that had been quietly building behind closed doors. Money had been tight. Responsibilities had piled up. Conversations that once flowed easily had turned short, cautious, and sometimes sharp. Small disagreements were rarely resolved. They were simply buried. And buried emotions don't disappear. They wait. That morning, they planned to run errands together. A simple drive. A normal task. Nothing that should have mattered. As they pulled onto the road, the silence inside the car was heavy. Not angry, just strained. The kind of silence that comes when words feel risky. When every sentence might turn into an argument. Traffic moved slowly. The city felt ordinary, predictable. Then the wife glanced down at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was low. She asked a question. "Did you put gas in the car?" It wasn't shouted. It wasn't aggressive. It was the kind of question millions of couples ask every day without consequence. But in that moment, it landed differently. To him, it didn't sound like curiosity. It sounded like criticism, like blame, like another reminder that he wasn't doing enough, that he was failing at something small, but symbolic. The atmosphere changed instantly. His response was sharp, defensive. Her reply followed just as quickly. What began as a casual exchange turned tense, then heated. Voices rose. Accusations surfaced, some old, some new, some never meant to be spoken out loud. The car slowed. Witnesses later said they noticed the vehicle stop suddenly along the street. A couple arguing inside. Nothing unusual, until it was. The argument spilled out of the car and onto the pavement. Nearby residents heard raised voices. A man yelling. A woman trying to explain. Some said it sounded like frustration. Others said it sounded like fear. But no one called the police. Why would they? People argue all the time. Couples fight. It's uncomfortable, but it's normal. No one expects a disagreement over gas to turn into something lethal. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. The escalation was fast. Too fast for reason to catch up. Words turned cruel. Tempers flared. Pride took over. And then something shifted. According to police reports, the husband retrieved a firearm from the vehicle. Whether it was legally owned or not would later become part of the investigation. But in that moment, the presence of the weapon changed everything. The argument crossed a line it could never return from. Neighbors heard the sound before they understood what it meant. Gunshots. Sharp. Loud. Final. People froze. Some dropped to the ground. Others ran toward their doors. A few looked out their windows in disbelief. When the noise stopped, the street fell silent. A woman lay motionless. Her husband stood nearby. The weight of reality crashing down on him all at once. The anger that had consumed him seconds earlier vanished, replaced by shock and horror. But it was too late. Someone screamed for help. Another neighbor dialed 911 with shaking hands. Sirens filled the air within minutes. Police arrived to a scene that made no sense at first glance. No robbery, no masked attacker, no signs of an ambush. Just a domestic dispute that had ended in death. The husband was taken into custody without resistance. Witnesses said he appeared dazed, like someone waking up from a nightmare they couldn't escape. Paramedics pronounced the woman dead at the scene. The question everyone kept asking echoed through the neighborhood. How did it come to this? As detectives secured the area, they began asking the questions that always follow tragedies like this one. Had there been previous violence? Threats? Calls to police? Restraining orders? The answer again and again was no. No known history of abuse. No prior arrests. No obvious warning signs. To many, that made the case even more disturbing. Because if it could happen here, over something this small, it could happen anywhere. As the investigation unfolded, police would soon discover that the real story wasn't about gas, or a car, or even that single argument. It was about everything that came before it. The silent resentments, the unresolved conflicts, the pressure that had been building for years. And in the next part, detectives would uncover what was happening behind closed doors. Details that would reveal how a trivial question became the trigger for an irreversible act. Because sometimes, the most devastating crimes don't begin with hatred. They begin with silence. By the time police tape sealed off the street, the damage had already been done. Neighbors stood in small clusters, whispering, pointing, struggling to understand what they had just witnessed. Some replayed the argument in their minds, wondering if they had missed a moment when they should have intervened. Others stared at the lifeless body on the pavement, still unable to connect it to the shouting they had heard only moments earlier. To them, it all felt unreal. But for investigators, reality had already begun to take shape. The husband was taken into custody almost immediately. He didn't run. He didn't resist. According to officers on the scene, he appeared disoriented, like someone who had crossed a line without fully realizing it until it was far too late. In the patrol car, he said very little. Back at the scene, detectives began doing what they always do, separating emotion from evidence. They measured distances, marked shell casings, took photographs, interviewed witnesses while memories were still fresh. Everyone seemed to say the same thing. It started as an argument. It didn't seem serious at first. No one thought it would turn violent. One neighbor told detectives they heard the woman say something that sounded like an explanation, maybe an attempt to calm things down. Another said they heard the man yelling, his voice rising sharply just seconds before the gunshots. No one heard a threat. No one heard a warning. That absence troubled investigators, because violence without warning is often the most dangerous kind. At the police station, the husband was questioned. At first, he sat in silence, head in his hands, breathing unevenly. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. He admitted to the argument. He admitted to the shooting. But he insisted he never intended to kill her. "It just happened," he said. "I lost control." Detectives had heard those words many times before. They asked him to walk through the events again, slowly. What started the argument? Why did it escalate? At what point did he retrieve the weapon? As he talked, a picture emerged, not of a calculated murder, but of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. Financial stress had been mounting. Bills, expectations, a feeling that he was constantly being judged, not just by his wife, but by life itself. The question about gas, he said, felt like the final insult. Small to anyone else, but devastating to him in that moment. Psychologists later described it as a triggered rage response, when a minor incident ignites deeply buried anger, shame, and resentment. But the law doesn't excuse rage. While the husband sat in custody, detectives turned their attention to the couple's private life. They searched the home, examined phones, reviewed text messages, emails, and call logs. What they found wasn't explosive, but it was revealing. Messages showed tension in the days leading up to the shooting. Complaints about money, about responsibilities, about feeling unheard. Nothing threatening, nothing criminal, just the slow erosion of communication. Friends and family were interviewed next. Most were stunned. They argued sometimes, but nothing serious. They kept to themselves. "I never thought he was capable of this." There were no prior police reports, no restraining orders, no documented abuse. To the outside world, this was an ordinary marriage with ordinary problems. That made the case more disturbing, not less, because it suggested that the danger had been invisible. As news of the crime spread, headlines focused on the shocking simplicity of the trigger, a question about gas. The public reacted with disbelief. Online comments poured in. some condemning the husband, others trying to understand how such a minor dispute could end a life. But detectives knew the truth was more complicated. The argument wasn't the cause. It was the spark. The Real fuel had been accumulating quietly for years. At the autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed what everyone already knew. The gunshot wounds were fatal. Death had been quick, final. There was no chance of survival. For the victim's family, the confirmation was devastating. Grief mixed with anger. How could someone they trusted take her life so suddenly? Over something so meaningless? For them, the why would never be enough. As prosecutors prepared charges, they faced a familiar challenge, proving intent. The defense would likely argue that the shooting was unplanned, a crime of passion. The prosecution would argue that retrieving a firearm and pulling the trigger, no matter the emotion, was a deliberate act. The case would hinge on seconds. Seconds of anger. Seconds of choice. Seconds that changed everything. Meanwhile, the neighborhood tried to return to normal. Cars drove past the spot where the shooting happened. Children walked to school. Life moved on, but with a new awareness. People locked their doors a little tighter. Arguments sounded a little louder. Silences felt more dangerous. Because if a question this small could end in death, what else might be hiding beneath the surface of everyday life? In the next part, investigators will uncover the deeper psychological layers behind the crime and the courtroom battle that would determine whether rage could ever be mistaken for accident. Because once the moment passes, only consequences remain. And this case was just beginning. From the streets into the courtroom, one question dominated every conversation. Who was he before this happened? Prosecutors and defense attorneys knew the answer could determine everything. To the public, the husband was now defined by a single moment, the moment he pulled the trigger. But the court needed more than headlines. It needed context, motive, intent. And that meant dissecting a marriage that, until now, had appeared painfully ordinary. Investigators dug deeper into the couple's lives, searching for signs that this tragedy had been building towards something inevitable. They reviewed years of records, employment history, financial statements, medical files, and personal communications. What they found was not a trail of violence, but a pattern of emotional pressure. The husband had been struggling quietly. Work instability, mounting bills, a growing sense of inadequacy. Friends later described him as withdrawn in the months leading up to the shooting. Less talkative, more irritable, prone to shutting down instead of opening up. The wife, on the other hand, was described as practical and direct. Someone who asked questions, expected accountability, and didn't sugarcoat concerns. To many, those traits were strengths. But inside a fragile emotional dynamic, they became friction points. Psychologists who later reviewed the case explained how unexpressed resentment can transform minor interactions into perceived attacks. When communication breaks down, even neutral questions can feel like judgment. And that morning, the question about gas landed on an already fractured foundation. Still, none of this explained why the argument ended in gunfire. That's where the concept of rage trigger escalation entered the courtroom. Expert witnesses testified that some individuals experience emotional overload when stress accumulates without release. When a trigger occurs, often something trivial, the response can be sudden, intense, and disproportionate. But experts were careful to clarify one thing. Rage explains behavior. It does not excuse it. The prosecution argued that regardless of emotional state, the husband made a conscious decision to retrieve a firearm. That decision, they said, was the point of no return. This wasn't an accident, the prosecutor told the jury. This was a choice. The defense countered with a different narrative. They painted a picture of a man who snapped under pressure. A man who did not wake up that morning intending to kill his wife. A man overwhelmed by emotion, who acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage. He didn't plan this, the defense argued. He lost control. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They replayed surveillance footage from nearby buildings. They called neighbors who described the argument. They emphasized the seconds between the argument and the shots, the time it took to reach for the weapon. Seconds are enough to choose, the prosecutor said. The courtroom was often silent as testimony unfolded. Family members sat on opposite sides of the room, separated not just by benches, but by irreversible loss. The victim's family struggled to reconcile the man they once trusted with the man on trial. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others stared at him, searching for something. Remorse, explanation, regret. When the husband finally took the stand, his voice was barely audible. He described feeling cornered, embarrassed, overwhelmed. He said the argument made him feel small, exposed, and angry all at once. He spoke of a pressure he couldn't explain, like something inside him exploded. "I didn't mean to do it," he repeated. "I never wanted this." But under cross-examination, the prosecution pressed him on the critical moment. "Did you know the gun was there?" "Yes." "Did you retrieve it yourself?" "Yes." "Did you pull the trigger?" "Yes." With each answer, the defense's argument weakened. Outside the courtroom, public reaction remained divided. Some saw the case as a chilling example of domestic violence. Others saw it as a warning about mental health, emotional suppression, and the dangers of unresolved conflict. Social media debates raged on, but inside the courtroom, only facts mattered, and the facts were unforgiving. As the trial neared its conclusion, jurors were reminded of what was truly at stake. Not just the fate of the man on trial, but the meaning of accountability. Could anger reduce responsibility? Could emotional collapse erase consequence? The judge instructed the jury carefully. Sympathy was not a defense. Emotion was not a justification. A life had been taken. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied into anxious silence. Families waited. Lawyers paced. The defendant sat alone, staring at the table in front of him. Hours passed, then days. And when the jury finally returned, everyone knew the moment had arrived. The moment when tragedy would be given a legal name. In the next part, the verdict will be delivered, and the full weight of the consequences will come crashing down, not just on one man, but on every life connected to that single fatal moment. Because once the smallest dispute becomes the deadliest outcome, there is no going back. The courtroom was silent when the jury filed back in. Every footstep echoed. Every breath felt heavy. Family members clutched tissues. Some stared straight ahead. Others couldn't bring themselves to look at the man seated at the defense table. The same man whose life had once been intertwined with the woman who was now gone forever. The judge asked the jury foreperson to stand. The verdict would answer the question everyone had been wrestling with since the shooting. Was this a tragic accident fueled by rage, or a crime that demanded full accountability? On the charge of murder, the foreperson said, voice trembling, "We find the defendant guilty." The words landed like a physical blow. A cry broke the silence from the victim's family. One relative collapsed into a chair. Another covered their face, shoulders shaking. Years of grief, anger, and unanswered questions surged to the surface all at once. Across the room, the defendant closed his eyes. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, just finality. The judge ordered the courtroom to remain calm as sentencing was scheduled for a later date. But for everyone present, the outcome was already clear. A single moment of unchecked anger had sealed the fate of two families. In the weeks that followed, impact statements were prepared. The victim's sister spoke first. She described a woman who was dependable, loving, and strong. Someone who showed up for others. Someone who deserved to grow old. She spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated again. Calls that would never be returned. A future erased over something that should never have mattered. Over a question about gas, she said through tears. That's how she died. Other family members followed, each testimony layering grief upon grief. Then it was the defendant's turn. He stood slowly, hands shaking. "I live every day knowing what I took," he said. "I can't undo it. I can't fix it. I lost control, and now everyone is paying for it." His words echoed through the room, but they couldn't cross the distance between remorse and reality. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was filled again. The judge spoke deliberately, addressing both sides. "This case is not about a tank of gas," the judge said. It is about choice, about escalation, about the irreversible consequences of violence. The sentence was lengthy, decades behind bars, a lifetime of regret. As the gavel fell, the defendant was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Headlines would soon reduce the entire tragedy to a single sentence. A man killed his wife after an argument about gas. But those words could never capture the depth of what was lost. In the neighborhood where the shooting happened, life continued, but not unchanged. Residents installed security cameras. Arguments seemed louder. Silence felt heavier. The spot where the woman fell became a quiet reminder that violence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a normal day. Experts later used the case in domestic violence training programs, not because it fit a familiar pattern, but because it didn't. There were no previous arrests, no restraining orders, no obvious red flags. That's what made it so dangerous. Unchecked emotions, unspoken resentment, access to a weapon, all waiting for a trigger. Psychologists emphasize that rage doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows when people suppress emotions instead of confronting them, when communication fails, when pride replaces vulnerability. But again, understanding does not mean excusing. This case left behind a question that lingers far beyond the courtroom. How many relationships are quietly carrying the same pressure? How many arguments feel small, but aren't? And how many people believe they're in control until they're not? Because the most haunting truth of this case is not how extreme it was. It's how ordinary it began. A routine drive, a low fuel gauge, a simple question, and then silence. If there is any lesson buried in this tragedy, it is this. Violence does not start with murder. It starts with unresolved anger, with moments dismissed, with emotions left unmanaged. By the time the warning signs become obvious, it is often too late. The smallest disputes can carry the deadliest outcomes. And once that line is crossed, there is no turning back.